Jack Turner had always known the inside of Ridgway Manufacturing better than he knew his own living room. The hiss of the steam valves, the grind of the ancient conveyor belts, the click and snap of bolts under his rough fingers, these were the rhythms of his life. For 15 years, he'd patched up broken machines, coaxed stubborn gears back to life, and kept production lines running when everyone else went home. But no one asked him for more than that. To the higher-ups, he was just the old mechanic who never complained and never asked for raises. Jack's real gift hid inside the pages of grease-smudged notebooks he carried tucked inside his lunchbox. On every break, he'd sit alone at the corner table in the dim break room, scribbling diagrams and numbers while the younger crew laughed about weekend plans. He sketched new gear designs, improved belt systems, more efficient fuel lines. Nobody bothered him, and nobody cared. The factory had been cutting corners for years, patching old machines instead of buying new ones. Jack figured if no one else would solve the problems, maybe he could, at least on paper. That winter was bitter. Profits had dropped, the orders slowed, and a new manager named Brad was brought in to streamline operations. Brad was fresh from business school, eager to make his mark by slashing hours and pushing out anyone who didn't fit his new vision. Jack felt the cold eyes on him every day. He was too old, too expensive, and too quiet to play the politics that kept other guys safe. When Brad started watching him linger over his sketches, Jack knew the clock was ticking on his time here. One Thursday night, close to midnight, Jack stood alone in the echoing main bay, wiping oil from his hands. He could hear the buzz of fluorescent lights overhead and the faint hum of a forklift parked near the shipping dock. He didn't hear the door swing open until Brad's voice sliced through the empty space. The words came fast and sharp. "Turner, you're done. Pack up your things." Two security guards flanked the manager, arms folded, eyes blank. Jack felt a sting deep in his chest, but he didn't protest. He walked back to his locker, heart pounding in his ears. The break room was dark except for the dull glow of the vending machine. He sat down at the table one last time, pulled his notebook from the dented lunchbox, and flipped through the pages covered in his tiny, tidy handwriting. Diagrams of modified pistons, sketches of conveyor belt guides, calculations for fuel savings that nobody would ever read. Jack pulled out a fresh piece of paper and started writing. His hands shook, but his mind was clear. At home, Laura sat waiting in the small living room, knitting unraveling on her lap. When Jack stepped through the door, she saw it in his eyes before he spoke. He set his lunchbox down, hung up his coat, and sat at the kitchen table without a word. Laura made him coffee, sat across from him, and held his hands. They were rough, cracked from years of work, yet they trembled like a boy's hands now. Jack didn't talk much. He never did. But that night he whispered, "I'm not done yet." By the time the sun rose, Jack was still at the table. Papers were spread across the table and the floor, coffee mugs stacked on the counter, half-finished sandwiches pushed aside. He drew the last lines of a design that had been bouncing in his head for months, a simple upgrade that would make the factory's most troublesome press line run twice as fast on half the fuel. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't some billion-dollar breakthrough. It was practical, cheap, and exactly what Ridgway needed, if they had ever cared to ask him. Laura watched him roll up the papers, tuck them neatly into an old yellow envelope, and write Ridgway's address on the front. She didn't ask him what he planned to do. She trusted him. Jack walked down to the corner mailbox at dawn, hands buried in his coat, boots crunching on frozen snow. He dropped the envelope inside, took a breath of the biting air, and turned back toward home. He didn't know if anyone would ever open that envelope. Maybe it would just land in the trash, like he did. The next few weeks were hard. Jack woke up early every morning, hoping for a call that never came. He put on his worn jacket and walked door to door, asking for odd jobs. He fixed Mrs. Carter's squeaky gate, replaced old tractor hoses for a farmer out near the county line, and cleaned rust-off engines for guys who couldn't pay him more than a few bucks. Every night, Laura made him soup, and every night she told him to keep believing that good work didn't go unseen forever. One evening, Jack sat on the front porch in the cold twilight, listening to the distant highway traffic and the wind pushing through the bare trees. He thought about the factory floor, the clang of steel, the smell of oil and burnt rubber, the men laughing on break while he bent over his notebooks. He wondered if the machines would break again, if Brad's new crew would know how to fix them. He wondered if anyone would even remember the old mechanic who had kept it all alive for so long. Inside the house, Laura brought him a cup of coffee and wrapped an old quilt around his shoulders. She sat beside him, resting her head against his arm, telling him how proud she was. Jack smiled, though he didn't feel like a man worth being proud of. He was just tired. He closed his eyes and pictured the blueprint in that envelope, tucked away on someone's desk, waiting to be noticed. Maybe, he thought, tomorrow someone would see it and understand. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't quite finished after all. 2 months later, Ridgway's main factory floor looked different. Machines that once sputtered and stalled now hummed with steady purpose. Conveyor belts that always jammed ran smoother than ever before. The fuel bills dropped by nearly half. Overtime costs shrank, and the night shift could finally keep up with demand. In the manager's office, Brad leaned back in his padded chair, staring at a set of blueprints spread across his cluttered desk. The envelope Jack had mailed sat torn open in the corner. Brad drummed his fingers, trying to convince himself it had been his idea all along. The truth was, the board knew better. Word spread quickly when a struggling factory suddenly turned record profits in a season when their competitors were downsizing. Executives from corporate flew in to see the changes for themselves. They walked the lines, asked questions, and looked at the modifications that made everything run like new. They asked Brad who had designed it, who had built it, who had signed off on this brilliant patch that saved the company millions. Brad gave half answers, claiming it was a team effort, careful not to say Jack's name. But rumors have a life of their own. It didn't take long for the older machinists to tell the truth. They remembered Jack scribbling away on his lunch breaks, sitting alone with his notebook while others talked about football and poker. They knew whose careful hands had adjusted the gears to squeeze out every drop of power without wasting fuel. They knew who had saved their jobs when the place could have shut down for good. Whispers turned into stories, and stories reached the ears of men far above Brad's pay grade. One Tuesday morning, Jack sat alone at the kitchen table, tinkering with an old carburetor he'd promised to fix for a neighbor. Laura moved quietly around him, making tea and humming a tune from when they were young. When the knock came, Jack barely heard it at first. He looked up at Laura, puzzled, then wiped his hands on a rag and opened the door. There, in crisp suits and polished shoes, stood 2 men he'd only seen in the company newsletter, Ridgway's corporate directors. They held out their hands, calling him Mr. Turner. They asked him to sit with them. They asked him about his design, the idea behind it, how he managed to make something new out of machines that were decades old. Jack answered humbly, shrugging between sips of lukewarm tea. He told them how he'd always known the press line could run better if the fuel intake was tweaked and the belts redirected. He explained that he did it because he hated waste, because fixing things properly felt right. He didn't ask what they were doing here in his tiny kitchen. He waited quietly for them to explain. One of the directors, a tall man with silver hair and sharp eyes, laid out a proposal right there on Jack's old Formica table. They wanted him back. Not as a floor mechanic, not even as a supervisor, but as Ridgway's senior technical consultant. They offered him an office, a team, and a salary that made Laura cover her mouth to hide a gasp. They told him the company needed men like him, men who cared about working machines than fancy titles, men who could make a factory run better than any manager's memo ever could. Jack listened in silence. He thought about Brad. He thought about how quickly a man can be pushed aside when he's not loud or slick with words. He thought about the nights alone on the line when he kept everything alive while others slept easy at home. But mostly he thought about Laura, about the house they'd nearly lost when the factory fired him, about the promises he'd made her when they were 20, and certain that hard work would always be enough. He looked at her, and her eyes told him what to do. When Jack walked through Ridgway's factory doors again, he wore a clean shirt and a new pair of boots. He didn't brag. He didn't scold. He went straight to the floor, nodding to the old crew who grinned at him like he'd never left. The machines seemed to hum a little happier when he passed by, his boots echoing on the metal walkway. Brad watched from his office window, pale and silent, wondering how quickly rumors traveled and how long before his own bosses asked him the questions he wasn't ready to answer. The first thing Jack did was gather the young mechanics in the break room, the same cold room where he'd eaten stale sandwiches alone for years. He spread out the old notebooks on the table and told them how he'd done it. He showed them how to look at the lines, how to listen for the stutter in the belts, how to fix things before they broke for good. He told them it didn't matter who got credit. He told them that when a machine runs well, everyone's work runs well too. Word spread beyond Ridgway. Other factories called, asking for help with aging lines and failing parts. Jack took the calls, visited small plants in Rust Belt towns where men in dusty coveralls looked at him like he was some kind of wizard. He sat in break rooms and union halls, sketching on napkins and scrap paper, showing anyone who asked how to build something better out of something old. His quiet pride grew into something bigger, not fame but respect. He'd never wanted much more than that. Laura watched him each night as he came home, tired but content. She kept his old lunchbox on a shelf in the kitchen, a small reminder of how far they'd come. Sometimes Jack would find her flipping through his old notebooks, smiling at the greasy pages filled with dreams scribbled during long graveyard shifts. He knew now that good work doesn't disappear. Good work waits patiently for its chance to be seen. He had been the quiet man no one noticed until they needed him most. And when Ridgway's stock rose to record highs, when reporters wrote about the old factory that found new life, they sometimes asked Jack for quotes. He only said, "Machines don't quit if you take care of them. People are the same." He'd smile, shake their hands, and head back to the floor where the gears turned steady. The belts ran true. Tired, and a good man's last design kept everything moving long after the lights should have gone out.